At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The first time I went was in 2003. I was an unembedded reporter and I followed the invasion up from Basra and Qasr up to Baghdad, and then stayed there for, I think it was a couple of months after that, watching the beginning of the occupation. It was just completely chaotic. I mean, almost immediately things were going wrong with this sort of massive outbreak of looting that had already happened in the south. I mean, every government building. When you try to speak to the American soldiers, they say, no, we've got orders not to intervene. And there was always this kind of standoffishness all the way through.
There was a turning point in the early months after the statue of Saddam had been toppled. It was clear that law and order was breaking down in Baghdad and in other cities. It was a free-for-all, and Donald Rumsfeld in particular treated it very lightly.
We're seeing history unfold, events that will shape the course of a country, the fate of a people, and potentially the future of the region.
The neocons persuaded themselves that this would be the case, that once democracy had been brought to Iraq, it would start to spread like an ink spot across the region. And that spread of democracy to the Arab world would ultimately lead to a peaceful settlement in Israel-Palestine. They were proved absolutely wrong.
Over months, I mean, hostility, you could sense the hostility growing, particularly in areas like Fallujah. Pretty much every man over about the age of 20 had been put out of work. I felt the 82nd Airborne, who were there, actually turned what was a problematic relationship into a catastrophe. I mean, the politics inside the city meant that there were people who were perhaps prepared to deal with them, but the way in which they treated them meant that the insurgency took hold really quite quickly. And once it had started, it was very, very difficult for them to reverse it.
The execution of Saddam had two effects, I think. One was to reinforce this the lesson that ultimately, if you rule by the sword, you will ultimately die by the sword. On the other hand, justice was not seen to have been done. It was a hasty execution done for political rather than judicial reasons. And that, in the long term, undermined this idea that a body of international law might be formed.
Well, on the death toll, I mean, one of the great disgraces was this kind of constant refrain that whereas every American and British and other foreign soldier or contractor who got killed was dutifully counted, there was never any attempt, never any serious attempts to try and work out the number of people being killed. And there were an awful lot. I mean, you know, I would, you know, when the sectarian violence really started, I mean, you know, I would go to the morgue maybe once or twice a week because it was the only way to have a sense of what the violence was. The insurgency against the occupation was always far more complicated than could be packaged by the simple narratives that they wanted to sell. I mean, you know, you had former Baathists who had either an interest in trying to bring back the regime because that's what they believed in, or who'd lost out economically, or who, you know, who came from strong tribes, particularly in the Sunni Triangle, where they felt as though, you know, any kind of invasion would have been wrong. I mean, Saddam had difficulties dealing with those areas. And then you had the whole Sunni Shia dimension to it, and it was as if a lot of the time the US-led occupation was firefighting to try and bring it to a point where they could actually get any kind of politics to root, and that was their difficulty. And I still don't think they've solved the problem. There are still regular bombings. There are still problems. I spoke to a friend in Baghdad only 10 days ago. who described to me the roundup of neighbours of his who were Baathists, who are being rounded up and thrown in jail at the moment. And so you can already see just ahead of the American withdrawal, some of these tensions that had slightly receded seem to be coming back to the surface again.
Certainly General Petraeus has taken some of the credit for going out and finding people in Sunni communities who just had enough. And had enough of being ordered around by these foreigners and by these groups with a global jihadist worldview that were trying to take advantage of them and their national uprising. And so this Sunni awakening was born, and that helped to push back the violence out of Sunni areas. This and also the bargain that was done to create the central government in Baghdad between Shia and Sunni contributed to this quite dramatic damping down of violence that made it possible for the Americans to leave.
The question now is what happens, because, you know, in many respects, the conflict that's left in Iraq is kind of a classic frozen conflict. A lot of the tensions that were diffused to a degree still exist in political terms. I mean, those are issues that haven't gone away, i.e. between the Kurds, between Sunni and Shia. Those issues still exist.
I'm proud to finally say these two words, and I know your families agree. Welcome home. Welcome home.
The thing that struck me from Obama's speech at Fort Bragg, I was struck by the irony that he said, you know, we're leaving behind a sovereign Iraq. Well, it was only not sovereign during the US occupation before the government was put in power. He said, we've left behind a stable Iraq. Well, I'm not convinced it's a stable Iraq. I'm just not convinced of that. And no matter what you think of Saddam, and you know, I think he was a fairly repellent human being. I mean, there was more stability, you know, before the US invasion than in the 2 or 3 years of the worst sectarian violence. And he said he'd left a self-reliant Iraq. Well, I'm not entirely convinced that it is going to be a self-reliant Iraq. I think that it is still going to have huge problems and huge challenges facing it, and you know, whether it is equipped, what's been left behind, is enough to help it get through those challenges, I'm extremely dubious about.